Tucker Carlson had Rutger Bregman on his show. So this guy, Rutger Bregman, he was one of the people who went to Davos, which is the gathering of, like, elitists where they all sniff each other's farts and talk about how great they are and how they're going to save the world. He went there, and he's an academic, and he was basically, like, lecturing them on taxes and saying, hey, listen, during the golden age of economic expansion in the U.S., they had a top marginal tax rate of 70%, and 70 to 90%, actually. And even when you account for the loopholes and deductions, it was still like 43%, so it's much higher than it is now. And it didn't lead to economic stagnation. There was massive economic growth. Also, unions were incredibly strong, so you had the strongest middle class you've ever had in U.S. history. And he basically just schooled them on left economic policy. And it was glorious to see. There were actually two separate occasions of academics schooling the panels of elitists on, various left-wing ideas. And I think we covered the other one. I don't think we covered the one that Rutger Bregman did. There was another instance of another academic who kind of schooled them on these similar issues. Well, anyway, Rutger Bregman was invited onto Tucker Carlson's show to talk about this. And they start out getting along actually pretty well. But then by the end of it, Rutger says some things that pisses off Tucker Carlson, and Tucker melts down and yells at him, and this never made it to air. We're watching like a cell phone video from when it was recorded on Rutger Bregman's side of the equation. So let's take a look, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
It's one of the great moments, maybe the great moment in Davos history. Rutger Bregman is the author of Utopia for Realists, and he joins us now. Mr. Bregman, I can't stop laughing just listening to that. And part of it makes me wonder, are you the first person ever to note that people are flying private to talk about global warming and that none of them mention tax avoidance? Has anyone ever said that before at Davos that you know of?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on Davos history, but it is a bit hypocritical, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And others have noted that. We've noted it on this show. We've just never gone to Davos and said it out loud as you did. So if I was wearing a hat, I would take it off to you. What response did you get?
I mean, they were not very happy with me, but I'm just I think, a random Dutch historian who's basically saying what everyone around the globe is thinking. You know, the vast majority of Americans, for years and years now, according to the polls, including Fox News viewers and including Republicans, are in favor of higher taxes on the rich. You know, higher inheritance taxes, higher top marginal tax rates, higher wealth taxes. It's all really mainstream. But no one's saying that at Davos, just as no one's saying it on Fox News, right? And I think the explanation for that is quite simple, is that most of the people in Davos, but also here on this channel, have been bought by the billionaire class. You know, you're not meant to say these things. So I just went there and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to say it, just as I'm saying it right here on this channel.
Well, what was interesting, I thought, about what you said was you noted something. I mean, many people have called for higher taxes, but very few.
Well, not on this channel, is it? I mean, almost all of the pundits on this channel for years have been against higher taxes, right? Even though the vast majority of Americans is in favor of it.
I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting to know how many hours of Fox you've watched, but I'm interested in what you said about tax avoidance. So,
yeah.
I mean, just because someone faces a specific tax rate does not mean that person pays that tax rate at all. I don't think Netflix, for example, paid any taxes last year at all. So what would you do specifically to make certain that this class of people pays what they're supposed to pay?
Well, it's about multiple things. So we should really crack down on tax paradises and on tax avoidance. That's a major issue. But the thing is, I mean, you guys have brought into power a president that doesn't even want to show its own tax returns. I mean, who knows how many billions he has hidden in the Cayman Islands or in Bermuda. So I think the issue really is one of corruption and of people being bribed and of not being, not talking about the real issues. What the family, what the Murdochs basically want you to do is to scapegoat immigrants instead of talking about tax avoidance. So I'm glad you're now finally raising the issue, but that's what's been happening for the past couple of years.
And I'm taking orders from the Murdochs. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, it doesn't work that directly. But I mean, you've been part of the Cato Institute, right? You've been a senior fellow there for years. You've been taking their dirty money. They're funded by cock billionaires, you know?
Wait, why don't you tell me how it does work?
Well, it works by you taking their dirty money. It's as easy as that. I mean, you are a millionaire funded by billionaires. That's what you are. And I'm glad you now finally jumped the bandwagon, you know, of people like Bernie Sanders and AOC. But you're not part of the solution, Mr. Carlson. You're part of the problem, actually.
AOC, wait, but can I just say, and
it's true, right? It's true, right? That all the anchors on Fox, they're all millionaires. How is this possible? Well, it's very easy. You're just not talking about certain things.
Fox doesn't even play where you are.
It doesn't play where you are? Well, have you heard of the internet? I can watch things whatever I want, you know? I have, actually. I can't say I'm a great fan of your show, but I do my homework when you invite me on your show. So, I mean, you're probably not going to air this, but I went to Davos to speak truth to power, and I'm doing exactly the same thing right now. You might not like it, but you're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
But I am talking about these issues.
Yeah, only now. Come on, you jumped the bandwagon. You're all like, oh, I'm against the globalist elite, blah, blah, blah. It's not very convincing, to be honest.
Why don't you go yourself, you tiny brain, and I hope this gets picked up, because you're a moron. I tried to give you a hearing, but you were too annoying for me.
You can't handle the criticism, can you?
So, perhaps surprisingly, I have mixed feelings about this. I know probably most of you expected me to be 100% on Rutger Bregman's side here, but I do have some mixed feelings. So, first and foremost, let's just get this out of the way. On the substance of taxes and populism and on even scapegoating, I think Rutger Bregman is 100% spot on, where he's talking about how, yes, you have global elites, and yes, they're dodging taxes, and you know the real solution is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and left-wing populists. And then he talks about how there's a little bit of a bait and switch happening with the right-wing populists, where the right-wing populists talk about some of these economic issues, but then it's quickly like, okay, and that's why we got to blame the immigrants, and that's why we have to have really harsh immigration laws, and that's why if you're not doing well economically and you're a white working-class family, blame people who have less money and no power, who are just trying to make a better life for themselves, and that's where you should direct your ire. And so I think he's right about that dynamic. Now, the reason why I have mixed feelings is, and I noticed this recently too, where Ro Khanna tweeted something. It was, I guess Tucker Carlson had written something specifically on foreign policy where he's against like the regime change happening. And I guess Ro Khanna tweeted something that was kind of like a hat tip to Tucker Carlson. Like, okay, here, good point on the interventionist wars. And then Ro Khanna got just a fucking litany of hate. And people were like, hey, he's a white supremacist, and he's fucking a bigot and a xenophobe, and why would you give him credibility? And I was watching the fallout from that, and I was actually getting really pissed off, because I got news for all those people who were in Ro Khanna's mentions. You do know that the same week that you're attacking him for a fucking tweet, he's stopping a genocide, literally. Like, it was Ro Khanna who led the charge in the House to get us to stop Saudi's support of a literal genocide. Bernie Sanders did this in the Senate. You know who Bernie Sanders worked with? Mike Lee. You know who Mike Lee is? A vicious far-right winger. Now, there happens to be a few points of connection with the left, one of them being on foreign policy. Mike Lee's position wasn't as much, oh, I'm so concerned about the poor babies in Yemen. He was coming to this position from, I believe in the Constitution, and Congress has to declare war. So we didn't declare war in Yemen, so we're going to assert our congressional authority and say the president doesn't have the authority to do this. So he was coming from more of a legal perspective than he was a humanitarian perspective, but either way, he arrived at the proper position. I want to incentivize people arriving at the right position in every way I can. So when you bring up other issues, when somebody actually agrees with you on a different issue, what you're doing is you're telling them, you have to agree with me on everything or fuck you. Now, that doesn't take away from how horrendous Mike Lee is on basically 90% of political issues. And that doesn't take away from how horrendous Tucker Carlson is on immigration-related issues. But it does mean that if you have this philosophy of, even when somebody who's from a different school of thought agrees with me, fuck them, well then you literally get nothing done ever. Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul used to work together all the time. They worked together on drug policy. They worked together on foreign policy. So here's the main point. I am 100% for working with other people, as long as the point of agreement is on left priorities. It wasn't like Bernie Sanders was working with Ron Paul because Ron Paul is in favor of abolishing the FDA, and Bernie's like, you know what? I think that's a good idea. Let's abolish the FDA. Because then I'd be like, oh, open the gates of hell and go after Bernie too, harshly, and go after Ron Paul, go after both of them. But Bernie was working with Ron Paul on issues of, hey, maybe we shouldn't jail people for smoking relatively benign substances. Hey, maybe we should not do offensive regime change wars and we should get out of Iraq. So, in other words, what I would say to Rutger Bregman is, take yes for an answer. So this is an issue where Tucker's actually agreeing with you. Now, I do find it funny when he's like, he says to him, you're not talking about these issues. Rutger says that to Tucker, and he's like, we're literally doing it right now. Like, that's why I invited you on the show to talk about this issue. So I don't like that oftentimes when somebody on the left is given yes for an answer, they're like, but you're bad on all these other things. Yeah, that's right. So call them out on those other things, but take yes for an answer on the issue where they agree with you. Now, having said all that, the final caveat, and it's an important one, is this. Tucker is a little bit of a fraud because even though his rhetoric on economic populism is pretty solid, the reality is he supports Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is the ultimate fake populist. So it's hard to conclude that Tucker also isn't a fake populist. Because, yes, it's good that you're having this guy on to talk about, the fucking tax dodgers at Davos. But the reality of the situation is Donald Trump's tax bill is super serving that same tax avoidance crowd. And you were cheering on Donald Trump. It's the same reason why I say Steve Bannon is a fake populist. Steve Bannon did this interview with Bill Maher where he was like, I was the one pushing behind the scenes to make it so that we raised taxes on the top 1% in his tax bill. But then Trump did not raise taxes on the top 1% in that tax bill. In fact, they cut it massively, and you still supported the tax bill. So why should I take you seriously? That's like me saying, oh, I support Medicare for all, and then somebody proposes a bill that they call it Medicare for all, but then they do the exact opposite, and they're like, no, actually, we're not covering everybody, and in fact, we're taking healthcare away from people. And I'm like, oh, I still support that. Well, then I'm not supporting Medicare for all. I mean, that's what Steve Bannon did. Oh, I'm a populist on economic issues, but yes, I ended up supporting the bill where 83% of the tax cuts over a 10-year period went to the top 1%. I got news for you, pal. You're not an economic populist, regardless of what your rhetoric says. Now, in the case of Tucker Carlson, again, maybe you guys can point me to a video where he specifically goes after Trump for the tax bill, and he says, I don't support this, but my understanding is that he does support it, and he does support Trump. So if you support Trump, you're also kind of a fake populist. Again, I'm happy that he's having this guy on to talk about these issues, but ultimately, Tucker kind of uses this to loop people in to supporting standard Republican politicians, and those standard Republican politicians are not remotely populist. So, in many ways, he's a fake populist, and he's a fraud on these issues, even though his rhetoric is actually way more... Like, the thing that makes Tucker Carlson more clever than the other right-wing hosts is that the other right-wing hosts will wear it on their sleeve and be like Ben Shapiro, for example. Oh my God, we need to deregulate more. We need to not worry about outsourcing. This is stuff that he really believes. The standard trickle-down economics, pro-deregulation Kool-Aid that's pushed by George W. Bush and Ted Cruz and all these clowns, that's Ben Shapiro's argument, and he's upfront about that, and upfront almost about being an elitist and not a populist. Whereas Tucker talks a decent game on some economically populist issues, but he doesn't really follow through in terms of, if you really believed in the harsh rhetoric against the rich and you really believed in economic populism, you'd be supporting Bernie Sanders now, wouldn't you, Tucker? But he doesn't do it. So it's almost like he either doesn't believe in the economic stuff or the immigration stuff overrides his belief on the economic stuff, in which case, yes, it's all systems go for going after him, because I don't think he's right on the immigration stuff. I think he's got pretty draconian and primitive views, if you ask me, and pretty tribalist views, if you ask me. So I do. The reason I have mixed feelings is I feel like Rutger Bregman could have taken yes for an answer on the economic rhetoric, on the economically populist rhetoric that Tucker was seemingly agreeing with him on. But then in the process of taking yes for an answer, you can also hit him with a couple jabs and a couple gut shots and be like, hey, dog, listen, the classic trick from the right is to use fake populism and to rope people in with that rhetoric and then turn around and scapegoat and blame immigrants, which he did kind of do. But I felt like he could have done it in a way where it didn't lead to a total meltdown of Tucker and yelling at him. Like, it seemed like Walter, am I fucking up his name? Rutger Bregman was trying to get kicked off the show. It did strike me like that. Many of you will disagree with that, but that's what it looked like to me. Like, he was trying to get kicked off the show, and I thought that was weird. Listen, I've been on Fox News, so I could speak from a particular, perspective here that I don't think many people have. And my approach in these situations is always to co-opt my opponent's ideology against them. So if you go back and you watch my Fox News interviews, you'll see exactly how I go about doing that, okay? Where I'm always bringing up, yes, but the poll show, the Republican voters agree with me on this, and you use that. Yes, hey, when Donald Trump spoke about NAFTA, I wish he followed through on that. Donald Trump was right on NAFTA. So you have to frame it from the position of, hey, listen, I'm framing this from your ideology, and here's why you need to support left-wing ideas. And that's how, it's almost like, to use a crass example here, but I think it makes sense. It's like for the baby when you put the pill into the applesauce and they eat the applesauce and they think they just ate applesauce, but they actually just had medicine too. They don't even realize it. Oh, shit. All of a sudden, now they're in favor of unions, and they're in favor of stopping outsourcing, and they're in favor, like, all that stuff. So, I think he was trying to get kicked off, and that's why I think I have mixed feelings on this. I feel like he could have gotten his point across in a way that would have convinced more people in the audience, because now the reaction from Tucker's fans are going to be, fuck this guy Rutger, and fuck everything he's about. Whereas he could have done it in a way where he gets his point across and doesn't compromise his values at all, and people go, oh yeah, he's right about that now, isn't he? And that would have been better, in my opinion. But, I guess I could see both sides of this, and I guess I have a nuanced take on it. My guess is most of you guys are going to side 100% with Rutger, but I'm curious to see what you do say.